So, for this episode of Solace and Shine, it is my great pleasure to have a dear friend of mine join us. It's only taken me about 6 months to convince him to get to have a conversation recorded with me, but I'd like to welcome Dr. Adam Walker. Hi,
Hi,
how are
Shivani.
you?
Thanks. I'm doing well. Really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Um, just to give a little bit of context of who you are, um, Adam was born and raised in New Orleans. He's the founder of the Antrim Literature Project, which is designed to create a platform for anybody to connect to literature of all different types. And it's super accessible and super engaging and incredibly fun. You've just finished your PhD at Harvard in English literature with a wonderful dissertation on William Wordsworth. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And of course, you have your very popular YouTube channel of close reading poetry, which is
Mm,
actually how we met,
mhm.
right? Because
That's right.
I wanted to watch you close read Taylor Swift lyrics.
Uh, Is that right? It wasn't the William Blake?
No, I I
No, it was
I
for
wanted
Swift.
to I
Oh,
wanted to watch you do Taylor Swift, and then I was so impressed. I went through your catalog and saw William Blake, and I went, I need to see that.
is
Then I
that right?
watched you do that, and then I watched you close read Tintern Abbey, and everything changed.
Oh, beautiful. Oh gosh.
Yeah, yeah. So we can thanks to Tay Tay,
Right.
uh, we made a connection.
That's great.
Um, yeah. So I wanted to bring this conversation to this podcast because over the last 6 months, you and I have had some of the most beautiful, engaging, challenging, stretching conversations. And I think that there's some points in our current culture and
Mm,
in where we are as a humanity and as a people that can really benefit from what you're putting out into the world and what poetry is putting out into the world and what literature has to offer to put out into the world in a kind of different way than what is
mm,
the norm that I've been exposed to, which is incredibly dry and not something I really want to engage in, right?
mm, mm.
So when we talk about, let's start with close reading, because there's
Yeah,
so many people like, what is even close reading? So
right.
can you tell me what is close reading and why is it important and why should we even try?
Yeah, it's such a really great question. Thanks for asking. And it's one that I'm always thinking about. I mean, you're right about the study of poetry. It can be sometimes really, really dry, and it's been my attempt to kind of just get out of the way so the poetry shines, and so um, helping facilitate an actual encounter with the readers and their own reading of poetry, to kind of model that
Mm-hmm.
response. Because there's this very academic view of poetry, which is poetry is what exists on the page. And a poem is kind of an object that exists in the white space of a page. And really, a poem is really existing somewhere between the book and the reader. It's actually the reading of the poem, I think. That's the real poem. And so I think a good close reading models the encounter with the textual object, with the poem itself. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's got, emotion, it's got the reaction, it's got the impressions it's leaving on you. And that way,
Mm-hmm.
there's as many poems as there are readers who read the poem. So I think of close reading as not just like a really close attention to the words,
Mm-hmm.
which traditionally is what close reading became in the 20th century in the academy. And it was a great practice. But it's also closely reading your attention, your reaction to it. So I think it's kind of more of a holistic approach, and it's really difficult to teach that aspect. It's kind of a thing that must be learned but can't be taught. but it can be modeled. And I think that's something, with the discussions that you and I have had in the groups where we discuss poetry with folks and we kind of compare our own notes as readers, something really enriching about understanding that the poem isn't just what's on the page. It's not just the language. It's actually what is existing somewhere in the
Mm-hmm.
interspace, as Charles Taylor calls it, this space between the book itself and the reader. So I think a good close reading does that. It doesn't just look at the text, but it's also exploring how we're reading it and receiving it.
So when you say that, if I was going to put that
Mm,
description of close reading into a Eastern philosophical context,
mm,
I think the closest thing that we would come to in that is called something called swadhyaya. And
mm,
swadhyaya means self-study. Now, just kind of like how you described, where it can be very analytical and you're reading every word and you're understanding the translation of the Sanskrit, da, 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 which is one sort of like layer of awareness when it comes to swadhyaya, is to study the texts. But really, what swadhyaya is learning how to sit with the text to
mhm,
be able to experience the transmission, the energy, the experience, the aliveness of the text, and then choose whether or not you want to calibrate to it. And we would call that in training to that.
mm,
So when I watched you close read Tintern Abbey on YouTube that one time, I saw how Tintern Abbey completely came alive as an embodied consciousness.
mm. Wow.
That, yeah, that you through the way you were close reading it on YouTube was creating an awareness of this transmission that this poem has, of the shifts of consciousness that Wordsworth was going through at the
Yeah.
time, and then being able to entrain to that actually shifted my consciousness to experience what potentially Wordsworth was experiencing in writing it. And so for us, that would be swadhyaya, where you're entraining to the text, um, which is
I love
so
that.
fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah. Gosh,
I
that's,
didn't think it was possible outside of the Sanskrit texts.
oh,
I didn't.
really?
No, I didn't, because it's
Wow.
not something I've experienced.
And it's interesting you say that because it's not really something that I hear people talking about in my side of the world, the very academic,
Mm-hmm.
Anglo-analytical way of approaching poetry. It's really not a vocabulary for this. And so it's really interesting for me to hear you using these terms in a way that once you explain them, it's like, I wish we had a word for that, for what's happening,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so beautiful the way you described you have a change in consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Because I experience that with good poems, and I think that's really a mark of a good poem, or at
Mm-hmm.
least one that resonates with a reader is it leaves you changed in an interesting way. I don't always like the change, but I often do, But that's just a part of reading poetry. I love the way you describe that.
Yeah. So the transmission in the ways, like we've done a close reading group sessions with Eliot's The Four Quartets,
All right. Yeah.
which was for me life changing.
Yes.
Just to watch
Me
how
too.
much Eastern philosophy was woven through that, knowing that T.S. Eliot had actually studied Eastern philosophy at Harvard
Hmm.
before he went to England. And it to be able to look at poetry from this place, do you think that learning how to close read a poem has given you a deeper insight into a deeper listening into your
Oh,
day-to-day life?
yeah, absolutely. I absolutely do. It's interesting. Uh, I think that the more you close read a poem, and it's certainly true for me, the the more reverence and attention one brings to the moment of reading, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's reading a book or whether it's reading a leaf, it
Mm-hmm.
it it really dilates your awareness to everything around you, your
Mm-hmm.
sympathy, your moral capacity, even. And I think especially your imaginative capacity. Um, that the more you're able to closely read and to sustain and exercise a focused attention on something, whether it's a poem or whether it's a beautiful landscape or a painting,
Mm-hmm.
it certainly does, I think, enable a capacity for encountering. Um, we talked about this. We both uh, watched that interview by Jory Graham recently, and when she was talking about I think you shared it with me. It was a beautiful interview with the poet Jory Graham, who talked about how there are forms of entertainment that bypass experience now,
Mm-hmm.
and that what speed does is to shortcut the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have a lot of students. Sometimes I was teaching um, Paradise Lost, and instead of reading the books, people were going to Cliff Notes or Wikipedia. And that's fine. You can do that. You should supplement your reading to help understand what you're reading. But then they wouldn't actually read the poem. They would think that, oh,
Right.
I've got the plot. I know what happens. Therefore, I've kind of gotten it like a commodity. It's really a
Mm-hmm.
commodification of reading where it's like, no, you have to surrender your
Mm-hmm.
imagination, your attention. I mean, you're kind of on holy ground. I mean, it's interesting. Moses, when he approached the burning bush in the Old Testament, he was asked to take off his shoes, and I don't really know why he was asked to take off his shoes, but I think it symbolizes this unmediated encounter upon the grounds of experience, because you don't have sandals. It's
Mm-hmm.
just you and the ground, and I think that's what close reading can facilitate, these encounters, these unmediated encounters, which are experiences which change us.
Oh
So I
yeah.
think, yeah, especially now this is what we need. We need a heightened attention to the world
Yeah.
and also to poetry.
And you use the word imagination, but when you say imagination, I hear intuition.
Oh, interesting.
That
Okay.
it actually, yeah, allows the intuitional state of consciousness to come to the forefront because there's a presence in the
Hmm.
moment of reading poetry that allows the subconscious and the unconscious to come to the surface in a
Okay.
way that a very analytical left brain analysis doesn't. And that term surrender really brings it into a holistic experience of both hemispheres of the brain
Right.
into a wholeness, and that creates the embodiment that opens to the transmission that allows you
Mm. Mm.
to come into the entrainment.
Exactly. So this is really interesting to me. Would you say that intuition, and I really like that word for what we're talking about here, is like a kind of a sensitivity in a way, but not just like
Mm-hmm.
an analytical sensitivity, but emotional
Mm-mm.
sensitivity, perhaps even more.
Yeah, perceptive sensitivity. So we have the
Gotcha.
emotional
Yeah.
body, which is pranamaya kosha, and then we have the lower mind or the analytical left brain uh, perception. Then we have the heart perception, which is actually the higher mind.
Oh, wow.
And
Right.
that doesn't feel it, it perceives it. And that's where the intuition, the intuitive body, the higher mind, the higher soul connects into the moment.
I like
So we're
that.
really using poems as a portal
Hmm.
to
I like
experience
that.
the moment.
Yeah. It was really great. I mean, that's so interesting. I think that's a great way to describe what was happening in July when we all were reading the four quartets. I mean, it's so interesting that, me with my background in the West and especially the Christian tradition, and you with your background with the Eastern philosophy and stuff that I didn't see in the four quartets you were seeing and talking about. Uh, and then, there were the things that we could talk about. And then there were the things where you really can't talk about. There were moments when we were all like, I really love these lines. I have no idea where they come from or what they mean. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe so I guess my question to you would be, do you think that's part of like the higher mind, that it's just there's something ineffable about the encounter with poetry that you just can't really talk about? Is that
Yeah, I
just the
think
same?
that I think there's an aspect, especially poems like the Four Quartets, where there's an aspect of it
Gotcha.
where the analytical mind just has to let go, because
Hmm.
Eliot really was channeling a very specific bandwidth of his own experience into these, and it can't really be tapped into from the lower egoic mind of the individual to know. And so when you let go of that egoic mind and you surrender into
Hmm.
the I don't know,
Hmm.
then you can come up into what we call the Vijnana Maya Kosha, which is actually where all knowledge is stored and all experience is recorded in the Akash records. And from that place, you're able to tap into the consciousness of a being like Eliot, into what was he feeling, what was he experiencing, what was he perceiving in the moments to actually write these lines.
Hmm.
And then you can distill it back through. But as you distill it back through, it's got to come through your own filters and your own biases and your own conditioning. So it always gets a little distorted. But it's kind of like you can reach up and catch something and then distill it down into a hypothesis, not of an I
Right.
know what he was thinking, but in a this is the color, as we would say. This is the color of the poem. That's not a left brain factual thing of I know what he was saying, but it's
Exactly.
this is the bandwidth of energy, this is the bandwidth of color that I perceive this is coming from, and we can work that backwards to create a hypothesis on what is actually being communicated in these
I
lines
like
that I
that.
don't
Yeah.
rationally understand, but I can feel.
Right. And there's the intuition you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
That's that mode of seeing. I really like the way you talk about it because it's for poetry, it's not this documentary kind of, it's not a mode that's like communicating truth in a documentary or representational kind of way like
Mm-hmm.
prose will do. You actually have to leave that part of the mind kind of at rest when you encounter it.
Yeah.
Um, and that you're not talking about truth that you can prove. You're actually talking about an experience, which in
Mm-hmm.
sometimes goes beyond language. But I like that idea of distilling as maybe the form of intuition itself, the feeling of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All
And
right.
this is part of the dimensional the paradigm that we're in right now, is that
Mm,
you've got some levels of consciousness and some beings that want quantifiable proof to believe.
mhm,
So they'll
mhm,
come into an experience of something, and before they can embody the experience and stand behind the experience, they're looking for quantifiable proof to believe in it so that they can allow themselves to experience it. And that's really ass backwards. And it never actually does it. And it creates a lock or a grunty of
mm,
fear, and it stops the flow of energy. Whereas there's another way that we're able to perceive reality at this time, I feel, that where you're being thrown into these experiences, and then the experiences become distilled over time into things that you can relate to, quantify, communicate about, share with people. But at
mm.
no point do you need to believe in it, because it's your experience,
Interesting. Yeah, it just
right?
is.
It's your experience,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
there's no point, there's nothing to quantify,
yeah, yeah.
you know, and
That's
it's
yeah.
comes the other way. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
I love that. Yeah. I think it's also true for religious experience in a way. I mean, I think the West has really since the Enlightenment, and we might even take it further back to the Reformation in the 16th century.
Just saying, and
It's
the Enlightenment is not the same
mm,
as what we would use the term enlightenment. Can you define what you're meaning by
that's a really
enlightenment there?
good question. Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah. That's an
this was a
important
really weird
distinction.
conversation we had that day. I'm like, what do you
That
mean
was
by
funny.
enlightened?
Yeah, because in a way it's kind of the opposite of what it means. The Enlightenment was an intellectual tradition which kind of lasted over the long 18th century, began in the late 1600s, we might say, at least in the English tradition, and lasted up into the 19th. And it was a way of seeing the world that was very empirical. It was very rational. It was very
Mhm.
analytical, and it inherited all of this from the Reformation, and we're still living with aspects of the Enlightenment. And
Was
this
that the
this
birth of science?
yes, the scientific method kind of goes back
Right.
to the Baconian, yeah, so early 17th century, and then it really comes back during the 18th century and the Enlightenment. And this is interesting. You mentioned Wordsworth, but the Romantics, in a way, were countering that mode
Mhm.
of of seeing the world through only quantifiable belief and experience, and not experience, I should say. Um, and a really good example of that is the poem "We Are Seven" by Wordsworth, in which the
Mhm.
narrator of the poem is talking to a cottage girl, and she numbers her two dead siblings among her family, and the narrator says, "No, no, if two of your siblings are in the grave, and um there are five of you at home, then there are only five." And she says, "No, we are seven, because I go there and I eat my porridge, I knit my stockings." To her, the intuition is the
Mhm.
experience. She's actually experiencing it, the reality of their presence, even in their death. And that's something
Mhm.
that the Enlightenment narrator, he's kind of making fun of the Enlightenment here, just can't reckon with this otherworldly arithmetic of the cottage girl who's counting.
Mhm.
So yeah, the Enlightenment, we're still grappling with this in the way we talk about poetry, the way we talk about our experiences, which are spiritual, and it all has to be, I think, validated by the analytical before it can be experienced. I really like the way you said that, because I see that happening
Believed. Yeah,
before it's believed. Yes.
before it's believed.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Which actually whole in my experience of, teaching for however many
Mm,
years, it really actually the need to believe before you will allow yourself to experience completely shuts down your
mm,
ability to step forward,
mm.
which then comes into a power over paradigm
Yeah.
by enforcing these constructs of proper behavior and proper belief and cultural conditioning actually stops in some way the evolution
Oh, interesting.
of the collective until you get people like Wordsworth and Coleridge that break from tradition
Mm,
and say no, you know,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
which kind of brings us to my next question, um, which is to talk about the thisness or
Oh,
the
yeah.
the consciousness of poetry, the Holy Spirit in poetry, not necessarily from a religious perspective, but from a
Sure.
spiritual perspective. And you know,
Yes. Right.
uh, poets, have tried to explain these spiritual experiences, especially in someone like Wordsworth,
Mm,
divinity, God, whatever you want to call it, her, him,
mm, mm-hmm.
they. Um, what from a poetic perspective, what how would you explain the thisness? We would call it
Yeah.
transmission. We would call it the spirit, uh, divinity. But how would you explain thisness?
That's a really interesting question. I'm almost tempted to separate the thisness into form and spirit, but you can't really separate them. Perhaps that's my, yeah, no. Perhaps that's my, yeah, overdeveloped analytic style here, but I think one of the ways the Romantics thought about it was by thinking of organic form. So Coleridge, they
Mm-hmm.
got really interested in this German natural history idea of the Bildungstrieb, the formation drive.
Mm,
And it came out of natural history. So the German scientists at the time, out in Göttingen in the early 19th century, were saying, there's this drive in nature, there's this spirit in nature, and it's forming things into forms. You have leaves, you have trees, and you have shapes and animals. And so you've got this drive, this formational drive, or this creative impulse that is behind all organisms. They create, they maintain, it repairs the shape of the
Mm-hmm.
body. Um,
Shakti.
and Coleridge, oh, interesting. Is that what that's the
Mm-hmm.
word for it in your
Yeah,
tradition? Oh, wow.
Shakti is the energy, the
Shakti.
pervading energy of all.
Oh, love. Yeah, and Wordsworth talks about that energy too. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I really like this, and I think Coleridge liked it because he wanted to apply it to poetry and coming up with an idea of how poets experiment with form. Because if the idea is the life, the Shakti, the
Shakti, yeah.
formational drive,
The pervading energy behind the
when it
forms.
comes into language, the form should be shaped by that. You shouldn't try to
Mm-hmm.
fit that into a scheme of a sonnet
Mm-mm.
if it's not supposed to be.
Right.
And so he had this term for it, the esemplastic power, which I think it was kind of a he also took that from the Germans, Schelling's in Einsbildung, this interweaving of opposites to kind of shape into form, which is like this
Right.
power. It's a strange word he came up with, esemplastic. It just means, I think, kind of the shaping power of the
Right.
imagination. And so if you think of a poem from that way, where it's actually got a life to it, and it's got a form from that life to it,
Mm-hmm.
then you're actually encountering something that's alive. And that's actually the way Dickinson viewed her poems, or she wanted to make sure that they were alive. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
really interesting way to describe words on a page, which, of
Mm-hmm.
course, as we've been saying, they're more than just words on the page.
Yeah.
Um, that's one way to look at it. I will mention too something really relevant. I know that we've talked a little bit about this, but Gerard Manley Hopkins takes this
Mm-hmm.
view and he develops this whole idea of inscape, which is, I think he would call it the thisness of things. He
Mm-hmm.
writes in his journals about the thisness of a fern, the inscape. It's this intrinsic beauty, this form of a thing. But then you have in stress, which is that force that's driving it into incarnational form. And
Right.
of course, these are all, within the Western Christian idea of things. So they're also Coleridge, Hopkins. They're thinking about the logos and the creative logos, the
Well,
word.
what's the logos?
So the logos, it comes from the Greek, and it just means the word. So
Right.
when the Gospel of John says, "In the beginning was the word,"
What's the word?
the Greek was, "In the beginning was the logos," in arche hein
And we say
hologos.
om.
And is that comparable?
Yeah, that's exactly. In the beginning
Oh,
was the
wow.
word, and the word was Om, A-U-M. It's the three frequencies of Shakti that create the forms from the consciousness of Shiva.
This is so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is why, like, when I first met you, and you, like, 90% of your vocabulary, I had no idea what you're talking about. And
Same. Same, though. We were on totally different lexicons at that time. It's very
totally
interesting.
different. We were like, could you please define this word? And it's just fascinating to me how when love is at the nucleus of something,
Right.
like how a poet writes poetry, it has to come from a place of love, even if it's
Yes.
poetry that's for reform, or it's poetry for expressing injustice or anger. It has to come from love. And
Yeah.
when it comes from that place, there has to be a thread of truth through it.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
And
Yeah.
that whatever word, inscape, or, whatever the terms, or Coleridge's symbol, or, Wordsworth's capital N nature, or anything like that, it's all actually just saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's so beautiful and so relevant to right now,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we're going through a huge cultural change.
Are we?
We
Yeah. Oh,
are.
everyone on the planet or
Everybody. No,
North
like
America?
completely everybody on the planet. I mean, there are different timelines working at this time, but um there's a huge cultural and consciousness shift that we're in, and which kind of brings me to one of the points that we first connected on, because Pluto moving from Capricorn to Aquarius was exactly the same transit that was happening when Wordsworth was writing the romantic poetry. And so it's got this power over, from his perspective, there was a lot of the church was very, you know, indoctrinated in the culture of everything ran through that filter. And so even when we read stuff now, it still gets run through that filter. But the way that he wrote, like Tintern Abbey or Ode or My Heart Leaps or any of those, even the boy with the owls. I can't remember what's the title of that poem.
I think it's just called The Boy of Winander, I believe.
The boy of Winander, right?
Yeah.
um he's shifting the power out of the external having power over and coming into that, what Emerson called self-reliance, which is the power coming from inside and how you perceive. And Wordsworth used nature as that portal of divinity, of Shakti, to Myrrh.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so
I think so.
why did you, what was it in you personally, if we can get personal for a moment? He's
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
oh. But what was it in you that was like, I'm going to dedicate years of my life to studying Wordsworth for my PhD dissertation, into breaking down what it is to have natural piety?
Mm. Wow, it's a really kind question, and really tough question. It's kind of you take an interest. Um, yeah, I think it was in a word, recognition.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about how literature is or reading is self-study in a way. I forget the word you used, but I remember
Swadhyaya.
swadhyaya, and
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned self-study, and I think in a way reading poetry for me was that. And it
Mm-hmm.
happened with Tintern Abbey. I mean, I remember part of it had to do with, my childhood. I grew up in the country outside of New Orleans, and then Hurricane Katrina passed right over my town. And so the woods and the fields and the creeks where I spent my childhood basically completely destroyed, and we were relocated. And it was in my kind of relocated exile, where I stumbled across Wordsworth, and I realized I had these encounters in nature that no one was speaking about, and I'd listen for them in songs on the radio, or in sermons, or in conversation in books, whenever I would read, because I didn't read much, and I no one was talking about it. But I read Tintern Abbey in a field, uh, in Florida, when I was like 15. I don't think I understood a single line of that poem, but there was something there. There was something that, like, I understood on a different level, I guess you could
Uh-huh.
say. And I think I didn't really understand that poem till about 4 years ago fully, and maybe I still don't. But I've been reading it for over a decade.
I think you're pretty good now, because your
I hope
ability
so.
to channel, because I've seen your energy body when you're reading Tinter now, like you actually are channeling the transmission of off the page into your
Interesting.
commentary on it.
That's really interesting. Um, yeah. I mean, if that's what I'm doing, which would be really cool, uh, that's part of why I wanted to study poetry and why I studied Wordsworth. I think he has
Mhm.
something to tell us today, and he does imagine future readers that there will come a time when his poetry will bring about a certain redemption. And of course, he's meaning, I don't know what he means. Um,
I don't know. I think redemption can mean more than the Christian, Calvinistic.
oh, sure, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I think redemption is responsibility,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
coming into a self-reliance and responsibility to redeem the ignorance that you've lived with.
Yeah. And that's a really good example of how language works on those different levels. Because I think
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk and share poetry because I know that there are other people who have these feelings and have experienced what the romantics feel in nature. But there's no way to confirm it because people aren't talking about it. The pop singers, Taylor Swift's not singing about it. The preachers aren't preaching about it. It's they're not making movies about it. But there are these experiences and encounters that we have in nature that, in a way, there's really no language for. But there
We do
is, and
have
I
land
found
breath.
it. Oh, yes. Okay. So you've, in the novel form, kind of explored these
Mm-hmm.
encounters then.
Yeah.
And I know that that's, people are doing it. And I found you through the YouTube channel and I find other people too who've said, really love this poet. She really speaks to me. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's almost like you find a vocabulary for your experiences. And when you have that confirmation, it's so satisfying. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the only one. And what it did for me, it prevented such encounters in nature and in beauty it prevented them from falling into oblivion, into forgetfulness. It
Mm-hmm.
really kind of kept them alive. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I spent so much time studying it.
I
Um,
think with
yeah,
the current astrological transits with Pluto,
right.
I think there's a real tangibleness. I mean, listening to you for hours talk about the romantics, reading your dissertation, the different lectures you've done on Coleridge and so forth, and the symbol. I think
Mm,
that there is a real portal. There's a real time space continuum, fissure that's happening right now between their shift of consciousness from power over into collective oneness
yeah,
in
interesting.
what they wrote is the mirror or an echo or the same consciousness shift that our collective is going from right now. And that's why I
Hmm.
really feel that bringing these poets, bringing these poems into our everyday language and into our conversations and into our consciousness actually is supporting our own evolution in this moment
Wow,
because we can use what they wrote to entrain to the shift of consciousness. And
interesting.
the proof is in the pudding. The
Hmm.
proof is in how people interact with nature, interact with each other, interact with
Yeah.
themselves, their perspective of do you have five siblings or seven?
Hmm.
What is your reality? Can you stand behind your reality? Is your reality creating more kindness, more love? Is your reality anchored in fear? Is it
Hmm.
anchored in love, moving through fear, or is it anchored in fear, moving through love? There's no right or wrong, but there's just an awareness of what's happening. And I think these poems speak to all of those different stages that we're experiencing right now.
Interesting. So, could I ask about the Pluto alignment that you were
Mm,
just describing? Because I'm
mm-hmm.
not, that's a part of, it's kind of a tradition that I've not been privy to or learned much about. Is this the first time Pluto has been, uh, so,
The cycle of Pluto is about every 240 to
okay.
248 years.
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, I mean, if you look at the bigger picture, the last time this Pluto transit happened was the American Revolution and splitting from the power over of the English monarchy. And it
Oh.
was the French Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
which was splitting out from the power over French monarchy into the people, right? So it's this pattern of going from power over of governments that where there is very rich and mostly poor or people that are having a lot of challenges to the power being transferred back to the people. That is what this transit is about. And so when you have people like Wordsworth, who went to France, who saw the French Revolution, who was incredibly moved, touched, and hurt, not physically maybe, but emotionally and mentally,
Mhm.
by the promise of revolution, and then seeing that things did not shift as drastically as he was hoping, or did not have as big a ripple, right,
Mhm.
from France throughout Europe, as he may have hoped. Like there was, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a real sense of like hope that he
Hmm.
sort of looked at the French Revolution from, and then with the reality of it and going and seeing the reality of it, I think there was a like a despondence, or there was
Yeah.
uh, a reality check,
Yeah.
right? And I feel like we're about to actually just go through this. We're
Ooh,
about to go through it. So it's,
that's scary.
well, it's, and also necessary, I think it's why we all signed up for the meat suits this time round, to all be adults this time round, to all have enough
Mhm.
consciousness this time round to be able to see it and to choose love and to choose conscious interactions, so that we can write, so that we can recite, so that we can speak from this place of awareness, of a heightened awareness and the oneness, that there is no other.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
within there is no other, there is also energy that needs to shift, just like, the tides that go in and out. The transfer of energy and the transfer of power happens. And it creates a different reality. When the tide is out, it creates a very different reality in the rock pools than when the
Mm.
tide is in. But both are natural occurrences. And we're here for a big tide,
Mm.
you
Wow.
know. But I think these poets and these poems have such a gift to us,
I think
if
so
we
too. Yeah.
if we can tap in. So we've got like
Yeah.
poets that had either formal training or informal training in Eastern philosophy, that you've seen be influencing their poetry and
Yeah.
poetics.
Right.
Who would be on your list if you were like, I practice Eastern philosophy, I do this, I'm starting into poetry. Who are some of the classics that you'd be like, oh, I can see aspects that come through?
Yeah. Ooh, that's really interesting because it was around the 1830s when I believe it was in the early 19th century when translations of some Eastern texts were making their
Mm-hmm.
way on the continent, in Germany, in England, and in America. And those who read it, some of them are really taken by it. So there are those who we know read some of these texts. Some of the German romantics read them. Um, Emerson read them. I hear
Mm-hmm.
he had a pretty poor translation of some of the texts. So, you know,
And some of
take
that kind
take
of
it with a grain.
transfers into some
It,
of his poetry, where it's
oh,
like,
interesting.
that's kind of the teaching, but not quite.
Yeah, yeah, that's
But it is
interesting.
still there.
Yeah, and so somebody who knows that actually and has an acquaintance with the Eastern traditions will see it in a way that many people in the academy won't. And so
Mm-hmm.
Ralph Waldo Emerson is a great one.
Mm-hmm.
Henry David Thoreau is interesting, although he was more interested in like Chinese texts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Walt Whitman, we don't know what he's read. I'm not I actually don't know if he's read translations of Eastern texts, but his poetry is so not Western in a way
Mm-hmm.
that puts Emerson way behind him. I mean, he's so, I don't know if you would call it a non-dualism, which we did find when we were reading Whitman
Yeah,
together with
yeah.
the reading group,
Was
Um,
kind of like
yeah.
Emerson's frequency, or the way that I perceived Emerson's writing, especially in
Mhm.
Self-Reliance,
Mm.
where he's very much talking about, the oneness and taking responsibility for your reality from that place, which we would call, the guru inside of us, which
Mm.
you have to be at a state of consciousness to be able to realize that. But Emerson, I feel, really embodied that and really
Yeah.
really got that on a level I don't think many English people could
Mm-mm.
embody. So I thought Emerson was amazing. Thoreau, I thought he was a little bit, we've had this discussion, I thought he was a bit more of a teenager, where he
Yeah.
was like hearing the teachings but wasn't embodying them, but was
Yeah.
able to put them down anyway, and they've lasted. So they're speaking to like an elementary school type level of consciousness, but it's also
Mm.
needed, right?
Mm.
Because not everybody can hear Emerson. Some people
Yeah.
have got to hear Thoreau. And then Whitman, I mean, Song of Myself
Oh,
really was written from the omnipresent oneness,
yeah.
which is not how it's read, I find. Is that because people reading it don't understand the omnipresent oneness,
Interesting.
and so they're unable to read it from that perspective, so they're constantly trying to shove it through their ego to
Oh,
understand from that individual perspective what Whitman was saying. But I think if you read Whitman, especially Song of Myself, from that omnipresent oneness, you really understand
yeah.
that he was trying to embody and relay through his poetry the embodied experience of
Absolutely.
oneness.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I think that, a comparable tradition that Whitman was raised in was or that he at least had acquaintance with in his childhood was Quakerism. And they have
Mm-hmm.
this doctrine of the inner light that guides one. I think he used the
Mm-hmm.
term, was it the inner guru?
Yeah, the guru,
Yeah,
the inner guru.
that's interesting because that's very comparable to the kind of Western traditions of Quakerism that he was aligned with in
Mm-hmm.
his youth. So maybe it comes from there, but it's really interesting. I mean, you formulated the question like which of these authors read it, took it in, and then put it in their poetry. There's also a really important aspect of the Eastern scripture informed person reading the texts, whether or
Mm-hmm.
not their authors were informed by it. Like we were talking about William Blake, I think he also has this kind of non-dualistic, I think you mentioned.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so
And I think
somebody
that's
with
what
that
makes William Blake so challenging for so many people to read.
yeah, including myself. He he's
Because
tough.
yeah,
For me.
he is, but
For
he's
me.
very much from that oneness. But then T.S. Eliot's
T.S.
quartets,
Eliot.
I mean, he's literally talking about Krishna
Yeah,
in
he is. That's right.
it's not, is it Little Gidding or the one before, the
I
third one?
think it's little Gidding. It might have been the Dry Selvages, but
The Dry Self Ages.
I
Yeah,
want to say
because
it was
it's
Little Gidding.
when he was in the US, and his wife had gone into the asylum. They were
Yes.
breaking up, and she was about to go into, she had mental
Yeah.
health
Yeah.
issues, and he was trying to discern right action, and he references the Gita like a lot. And then of course he references at the end of the Wasteland the I think it's the 10th Upanishad, which is to Brihaspati.
Mm-mm.
He has the last lines in there that he's actually writes out in Sanskrit. um
We need that perspective. All of you who are informed in Eastern philosophy, we kind of need it to see it. Because I think you're right. I think Eliot went there. And he
he
also
totally went there.
he also wrote about it. And honestly,
Mm-hmm.
like reading the four quartets with that information that you were bringing actually made the four quartets more intelligible to me. Maybe intelligible is the wrong word, but apprehendable, feel
Relatable,
relatable. Yeah, uh,
accessible.
yeah, yeah. Like it explained a lot that
Mm-hmm.
was in there that was evading a lot of the
I feel
kind of
like there's
Western
so
Christian.
much in the four quartets that was Eastern philosophy that people
Yeah.
don't don't recognize. And I was thinking the other day, because I just watched this movie Blitz, with Saoirse Ronan. uh Really beautiful. I'm not somebody that can deal with a lot of violence. As soon as I go to a thought, my mind actually my nervous system actually has the experience of it. So anything that's violent, I really have a hard time. And so, I have this sort of like barometer when I'm watching a movie, like, we get 3 strikes and then we're out. Like I can't do it
Mm-hmm.
because I'll just cry
Mm-hmm.
all night. And we've even had that experience with some of the civil poetry,
Yeah, Melville,
um
right?
with Melville, yeah. But going back to the Blitz, it's like, I think it's Little Gidding, with
Mm.
Elliot, where he's talking about being a night watchman for the Blitz in World War II in London. And that's what this movie was about. And I'm like, here is this man who has incredible awareness, very, very well educated in Eastern philosophy, the oneness of everything, and is literally still being the one of the people that is looking out and sending the sirens for the bombs coming. Like that is a reality, an integration of a reality. And then to put it in something like Little Gidding was so beautiful and
Yeah.
so masterful, to even break that fourth wall of going into the astral realm with conjuring Yeats, in that conversation with his mentor. Is it Yeats or Yates? I don't know.
It's
Like,
Yates.
it's
Although the
Yates.
figure, yeah, people speculate that the figure in Little Gidding is Yates. I think they're probably right too. But yeah,
Yeah, well,
Yates.
Robert Hass in his form, he also says that it's
Okay.
considered Yates. But even if you didn't know that, you could see he was breaking into the astral realm. And
Mm,
to hold the awareness of those teachings and to be in the reality of that incredible polarization working itself out, I think is a real shining light for this moment.
mm, yeah. Oh, I like that. Yeah. I
Yeah,
hope
a
so.
real shining
Yeah.
light that it can be done, and it will endure. The light will endure if
Yeah.
you will embody the light and create from that place of light,
Yeah.
even if you're speaking about the bombings.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's such a good, beautiful point. Yeah.
So we've got Eliot, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Whitman, Thoreau,
Oh, yeah,
Emerson.
Emerson. I want to say Margaret Fuller. I mean, she's brilliant. She was probably reading it. She didn't create much poetry, but she was a genius basically of Emerson's era and knew Emerson well. But those are good places to start. William Blake would
Mm-hmm.
be another.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Shelley too. I mean, I know a few scholars who are studying the Romantics through an Eastern philosophical lens for almost the first time, and uh, it's bringing new things to light that so many of us have missed, even though they weren't some of these poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge weren't really familiar with Eastern philosophy, and yet their poetry and some of the things they're saying are really compatible with it.
I
And when
think
you look
because
at
they
it,
were
yeah,
writing from experience.
right. Okay, so
And
that
the
maybe that's
Eastern
why.
philosophy is experience to distill
Hmm.
rather
Yeah.
than to learn to believe, right? The way that Eastern philosophy is taught is through transmission, is to
Mm-hmm.
experience it, embody it, and then create a reality from it, from what you believe.
What do you think about Emily Dickinson then in that
I
context?
I didn't see really a lot of direct Eastern philosophy references in her poetry. And in saying that, I feel that she really stepped out of the conditioning of the culture of the time to document her experience of the moment, of her humanity. And I think that she's got some of her poems that were just so on point with Eastern
Mm-hmm.
philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
but she didn't reference stuff like Eliot did. That
Mm,
it was like, well, this you can reference to the
exactly.
Gita on
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
chapter, blah, 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 blah. But the concepts,
Right.
even the word, even her poem about the word, can you remember it?
Um, a word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day. Is that one?
Yeah, exactly. And the word, the Vishuddhi chakra, is the portal into reality. It's called the Buna Vak, VAK, just in case my accent gets weird in there. Um, Vak, and that means to speak your reality. So the
Wow.
frequency of the words you're saying create your reality.
Mm.
So
Yep. Yep.
to
That's
speak the word actually creates life.
And we're kind of back to the logos then in a way,
And we're
right?
back
Because
to
we
the logos.
I see the logos as maybe the vertex of these two. Of course, this is a Western word we're using from the Greek, but like
Right.
maybe it's one of the
Um,
vertexes yeah,
yeah.
of where these traditions
Where
come
the
together.
point of connection, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I mean, truth has to. Reality,
Right.
there's so many different timelines of reality, but the truth is the truth is the truth, you know. And
Right.
that's the thread. And as somebody of the Saraswati lineage, that is the dharma of the Saraswati lineage, is to recognize the thread of truth through all philosophies, all religions, all states of consciousness, and to recognize the truth so that there is no other. Yeah,
Yeah.
no pressure.
Right.
Well, I know your time is incredibly valuable, but before we go, I just want to mention that
Mm.
Adam has an amazing Patreon community with what do you call them? Reading group? Like, what do you call it?
Yeah,
I
reading
call it
groups,
the
lecture
highlight of my
series.
week. So I don't
That's
know
what I
what you
call it
call
as
it,
well. That's
right?
yeah, lecture series and reading groups where we come
Right.
together and we read poetry. Yeah.
And we're going to be and we're going to be examining enchantment and the visionaries
Yes.
starting the end of
Yes.
January.
That's right.
So that is a great way of coming into community, or Sangha, as we would call it. And then, of course, you and I,
Yeah. Poetry workshop.
we are going to be running a poetry workshop called Lines of Light, the Art of Crafting Poetry, starting February for 6 weeks, 2 hours a week. And we're going to be learning how to close read. So this is not a
Mhm.
workshop where you need to have any experience. But if you do have experience, that's okay too, because it's going to be incredibly fun. And we're going to be close reading poems every week to create a vocabulary together. Not us telling you what to think,
Mhm.
but together coming in and seeing what, very much how Adam has his Patreon lecture series for that. And then every week we're going to have 4 people. So there's only 20 people in a class. We're going to have 4 people every week workshop one of their poems. And we're going
Mhm.
to learn how to come into workshop and in critiquing from a decolonized anti-racist perspective, which really throws the traditional critiquing of creative writing on its head. And it's inclusive and it's fun and it empowers. And the whole point of it is that you walk away from it wanting to write.
Right. Yeah. I think the cool thing that what we've done in designing is, a lot of times if you're studying poetry, you're either doing it in a classroom where you're studying the classics and you're not writing, or you're in a poetry workshop where it's just the workshop. But we've kind of blended that where we're not just reading classics, but also contemporaries and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully inspiring others to, find their own voice and figure out what kind of poetry they want. And also, as you said, the vocabulary.
Yeah.
Um,
And what lights you
I love
up?
that balance though. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. What lights you up? What inspires you? Is it the classics? Is it contemporary? And how can we talk about it? How we can we create a conversation that creates lives? It's not just about what's on the page, but it's about how we walk away in our own lives and how that creates deep listening and intuition and connection and sincerity and honesty and
Yeah.
safety. Like, this
Yeah.
is a place where your perspective is encouraged and safe to explore, and so I think it's going to be really fun. So we'll put all the
I
details
think
for
so.
that on here as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank
This
you.
was a treat.
It was a treat as well. Really enjoy it as always. Thanks so much for having me on the show.